Welcome to a story about science, ambition, and the price of discovery. Before we begin, leave a comment below about where you're watching from and what time you heard this. The Arctic Ocean, October 1957. The Soviet Union had just shocked the world. Sputnik was in orbit, proof that the Soviet space program had achieved what the Americans had failed to do. A satellite, no larger than a beach ball, was circling Earth, transmitting a signal that confirmed it. The future belonged to the communists. But while the world's attention was fixed on the sky, something else was happening at the bottom of the world, and on the frozen wastes at the top of it. The space race was real. But before rockets could conquer space, they had to conquer Earth's most hostile environment, the Arctic. Both superpowers understood this fundamental truth. Whoever could survive longest and operate most effectively in extreme polar conditions would dominate not just Arctic territories, but eventually space itself. The men who trained to endure 60°C temperatures, constant darkness for months, and total isolation, they would become the cosmonauts. They would be the ones launched into the void. In 1937, the Soviet Union had done something unprecedented. They'd established North Pole 1, the first scientific research settlement ever built on drifting Arctic ice. Not on land, not on permanent ice shelves. On ice that moved constantly, carried by Arctic currents, a platform that could disappear at any moment. This wasn't exploration for its own sake. This was strategic territorial claiming. This was the Soviets declaring, "The Arctic belongs to us." The technology was primitive by today's standards, but revolutionary at the time. Prefabricated huts were flown in by aircraft and assembled on the ice. Radio equipment was installed to maintain contact with Moscow. Scientists began their observations, measuring ice thickness, tracking ocean currents, recording meteorological data. But the real challenge wasn't the science, it was the humans. Imagine a winter in the Arctic. Not winter as you know it in temperate latitudes, a season with cold nights and gray days. Arctic winter is something fundamentally different. The sun sets in October and doesn't rise again until February. For 4 months, the darkness is absolute. There's no dawn twilight, no dusk, only midnight. The temperature at North Pole 1 dropped to 60°C on the coldest days, with wind chill making it feel like 80°C or colder. Frostbite could develop in exposed skin within minutes. The ice beneath the station groaned constantly, developing cracks that could widen without warning, potentially swallowing the entire station. 12 to 20 men, typically scientists, engineers, meteorologists, and medical personnel, would spend months in these conditions, confined to heated huts, unable to venture outside for extended periods, unable to leave if weather prevented resupply flights. The psychological toll was unexpected. Soviet officials had anticipated physical hardship. They hadn't anticipated what happened to the human mind in such extreme isolation. The first crews reported strange experiences, hearing voices that weren't there, seeing shadows moving in the darkness outside the station, a sense of profound disconnection from reality, as though the normal rules of consciousness were breaking down. One scientist kept a diary at North Pole 2 that would later become part of declassified Soviet archives. In entry after entry, he described the psychological deterioration. "The darkness is suffocating. I look around at my colleagues, and I can see it happening to them too. We're losing something, not our bodies, our minds. By month 2, the ability to think clearly has become a luxury." This wasn't weakness, this was a documented phenomenon. Researchers in modern times would study this extensively, the psychological effects of extreme isolation and sensory deprivation on the human mind. Depression, sleep disturbance, irritability, hallucinations, paranoia. In extreme cases, complete psychological breakdown. The American response came later, but it was equally ambitious. The Americans began Project Icicle in 1952, establishing their own polar stations on ice islands, massive chunks of ancient glacial ice that had broken off from the Canadian Arctic and drifted southward. Fletcher's Ice Island, renamed T3, became the American counterpoint to the Soviet North Pole stations. Scientists were flown in, equipment was installed, and the Americans began their own intensive Arctic research. What followed was not a military battle. There were no troops or weapons. But it was a race to prove who could master the impossible, who could take ordinary men and forge them into the superhuman beings required to survive environments that nature had designed to kill them. By the 1950s, the Cold War had become literally cold. The Soviet Union expanded its network of Arctic research stations relentlessly. North Pole 1 was joined by North Pole 2, North Pole 3, North Pole 4, and more. Each station was a drifting platform of ice, each manned by small teams of scientists who would spend months in total darkness, conducting meteorological and oceanographic research. By 1956, 3 Soviet stations were operating simultaneously on Arctic ice. By 1960, the network had expanded dramatically. Officially, these were purely scientific missions. The Soviet propaganda portrayed them as heroic endeavors. Soviet men taming the Arctic, proving the superiority of Soviet science and Soviet will. Newspapers published stories of brave cosmonauts enduring impossible conditions in service to the Soviet state. Moscow celebrated them as national heroes. But there was another dimension to these Arctic stations that was never discussed publicly. A hidden dimension that would only be revealed decades later when classified Soviet documents were declassified after the fall of the USSR. The Arctic stations were not just about science, they were laboratories. Not laboratories for measuring ice thickness or tracking weather patterns. Laboratories for measuring human endurance. Laboratories for testing psychological resilience under extreme stress. Laboratories for exploring the absolute limits of human consciousness under extreme isolation. In Moscow, in the highest circles of the Soviet government, there was a recognition. Space exploration would require men who could endure conditions no human had ever survived. The vacuum of space, the crushing G-forces of launch and re-entry, weeks confined to metal capsules with no escape, the possibility of catastrophic equipment failure, the knowledge that a single mistake would mean death. Men would need to remain sane while confined to metal capsules for weeks. Men would need to follow orders without question, even when those orders seemed to violate every instinct of self-preservation. Men would need to be psychologically prepared for death, to accept it, and to function despite it. The Arctic stations would produce such men. But this wasn't a decision made publicly or announced to the participating scientists. Some of them understood what they were really part of. Others never knew. But throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Soviet Union was running parallel programs. One public program of scientific research and one classified program of human experimentation. The physical environment of the Arctic provided the perfect cover. Extreme cold, isolation, and sensory deprivation occurred naturally. Any psychological effects could be attributed to the environment rather than deliberate intervention. Any breakdown in mental stability could be explained as the natural consequence of extreme conditions, not the result of scientific manipulation. But the psychological effects were sometimes too much even for the Soviet system to ignore. In 1958, the crew of North Pole 4 experienced what Soviet officials publicly described as unusual atmospheric phenomena. In classified internal reports, it was something very different. The men had experienced vivid hallucinations, not the occasional visual disturbance that could be dismissed as fatigue. Elaborate, detailed hallucinations. One crew member reported hearing classical music playing inside the station when all equipment was off. Another claimed to see people walking outside the station during the complete darkness of the Arctic night. But the most disturbing reports involved paranoia and what would later be recognized as severe psychological breakdown. The men began to distrust each other. They questioned whether they were actually on an Arctic station or if the entire situation was some kind of psychological test or elaborate hoax. By January 1959, the senior scientist at North Pole 4 was questioning his own sanity. His radio logs to Moscow became increasingly incoherent. By February, he had to be evacuated by emergency airlift. The official Soviet statement was that he had developed severe frostbite and needed immediate medical treatment. The classified KGB report told a different story: complete psychological decompensation, possibly irreversible. In 1959, the team at North Pole 5 reported something even more disturbing. They heard voices that seemed to come from outside their station, calling their names in the middle of the Arctic night. Multiple crew members reported the same voices, the same names being called. It was scientifically inexplicable. The station was 1,000 kilometers from any other human settlement. Radio equipment could not have been transmitting human voices to their location. Yet all 5 men who heard the voices described them with identical detail. Again, officially this was attributed to wind or atmospheric conditions. Scientifically debunked and filed away. In classified files, it was something that defied rational explanation. In 1960, a scientist at North Pole 6 attempted suicide during the long winter darkness. He survived the attempt, but he never fully recovered psychologically. Even decades later, after his death, his medical records described him as having suffered from chronic PTSD, severe depression, and persistent auditory hallucinations. Each incident was classified immediately. Each incident was removed from public records. Each incident was added to files that only a handful of Soviet officials were permitted to see. But the results were being studied carefully, studied with scientific precision. The Soviet government, specifically the KGB, the Soviet secret police, had become interested in these psychological breakdowns not as problems to be solved, but as opportunities to be exploited. What was happening to these men during their Arctic isolation? What broke first, the mind or the will? Could that breaking be controlled? Could it be directed? Could a man be psychologically dismantled and rebuilt to think differently, to believe differently, to be fundamentally transformed as a person? These were the questions that the KGB began to ask, and by 1961, they began to design a station specifically to answer them. In the archives declassified decades later, a single document would surface. It was marked with the highest classification level: secret and urgent for the eyes of the secretary and the chief of the GRU only. The document was dated March 1961. The proposal described a new initiative, Operation Nightingale. The proposal described a new research station to be established on the drifting ice of the Arctic Ocean. Ostensibly, it would be identical to all other Soviet Arctic stations, a team of scientists conducting research on ice dynamics, meteorology, and oceanography. But according to the classified document, North Pole 7, the full designation of the new station, would have a secondary purpose. It would be a laboratory for psychological research, for behavioral modification, for understanding the absolute limits of human consciousness under extreme conditions. More specifically, it would test whether a human being could be psychologically transformed through controlled exposure to extreme isolation, sensory deprivation, and environmental stress. The document specified the methodology. 12 men would be selected, all with military backgrounds and polar experience. They would be told they were participating in standard Arctic research. In reality, their responses to extreme stress would be systematically monitored and documented. A KGB psychologist would be embedded in the station, disguised as an ordinary scientific team member, recording data on every aspect of their psychological deterioration. 12 men were selected. All were Soviet citizens with military backgrounds. All had volunteered for Arctic research. All were celebrated in Soviet media as heroes, brave men willing to sacrifice personal comfort for scientific advancement and the glory of the Soviet state. None of them understood what was actually planned for them. They were told they would spend 1 year on the drifting ice, maintaining equipment, conducting observations, and helping to advance Soviet polar science. In reality, they had been selected as test subjects for something far more ambitious and far more sinister, something that the Soviet government believed could change the world, and something that would disappear for 40 years before anyone in the West even knew it had happened. Their names were recorded, their families were interviewed, their medical histories were compiled, but their true purpose, why they had really been selected, remained a secret. They had no idea they were walking towards something that would test the very boundaries of human sanity. The recruitment for North Pole 7 happened in absolute secrecy. No announcements were made. No volunteers were solicited through official channels. Instead, a select group of Soviet military officers received quiet invitations to report to a classified facility outside Moscow. The facility was known internally as Institute 7, though most outsiders didn't know it existed. In the spring of 1961, 12 men arrived there separately at different times to avoid creating a pattern that would suggest a coordinated recruitment effort. Each man had been carefully selected. Each had polar experience, some from previous missions to Arctic stations, others from training exercises in Siberia. Each had military training and the psychological resilience that such training supposedly developed. Each was ideologically reliable, no family connections to known dissidents, no doubts about Soviet superiority, no unauthorized Western contacts. But there was another layer to the selection. Soviet researchers in the early 1960s had developed what they called engineering psychology, a field dedicated to optimizing human performance under extreme conditions. This wasn't psychology as understood in the West. This wasn't about understanding the human mind. This was about engineering it, about identifying which humans could be pushed furthest, manipulated most effectively, broken most completely. The 12 men selected for North Pole 7 had been chosen using criteria that the Soviet Selection Board never made public. The Soviet military used a classification system for polar personnel developed by researcher Vladimir Kazanachev. He divided humans into 3 categories: sprinters, who could adapt quickly to extreme environments but would falter over time; stayers, who struggled initially but could endure indefinitely; and mixes, who exhibited characteristics of both. For North Pole 7, the KGB made a deliberate choice. They selected men who fell between categories. Not perfect sprinters, not perfect stayers, but men whose psychological profiles suggested they would break, and break in ways that would be instructive. These were men who had performed well under normal stress, but showed subtle signs of psychological fragility. Family issues that weren't severe enough to disqualify them, minor disciplinary problems, borderline performance on some psychological tests. In other words, they were selected precisely because they were vulnerable. When the 12 men arrived at Institute 7, they were told they were there for orientation for the most prestigious assignment in Soviet polar science. They would be part of North Pole 7, a cutting-edge scientific station on the drifting Arctic ice. What they were not told was that they had been selected as experimental subjects. The orientation lasted 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, the men underwent what appeared to be routine testing: physical examinations, psychiatric evaluations, aptitude tests. Blood was drawn, reflexes were tested, intelligence was measured. But there was another component to the testing that was not explained to them. A Soviet psychologist named Dr. Anatoly Petrov, a KGB psychologist who specialized in behavioral modification, conducted interviews with each man individually. Petrov wasn't just assessing their psychological state, he was identifying their vulnerabilities, their breaking points, their deepest fears. One man broke down when asked about his family. Another became defensive when questioned about his religious beliefs. A third showed signs of claustrophobia when placed in a small test chamber. All of this was documented in files that were marked for Petrov's eyes only. These weren't just personal notes. They were operational profiles, information that would be used later to deliberately manipulate and destabilize each man during the year on North Pole 7. By the end of the 3-week orientation, the 12 men had no idea they had revealed their deepest psychological vulnerabilities to people who would soon use those vulnerabilities as weapons. They believed they had simply undergone standard pre-mission evaluation. The 12 men were never formally named in the declassified documents. The most classified versions referred to them only by numbers or code names. But from less heavily redacted documents and from interviews conducted with surviving relatives after the fall of the USSR, researchers have identified some of them. There was the meteorologist, a man in his mid-30s with a wife and 2 children back in Leningrad. He had volunteered for the mission hoping for a promotion and a prestigious position within the Soviet Academy of Sciences. There was the engineer, a younger man, perhaps 28 years old, from the Siberian interior, a man who had spent his entire career in remote locations and who spoke little of his personal life. There was the doctor, a military physician who had served in the Arctic before and believed he was taking on another routine assignment. There was Dr. Anatoly Petrov himself, the KGB psychologist. This was the secret within the secret. Petrov wasn't part of the station as an equal researcher. He was embedded as a spy and a controller, tasked with monitoring the psychological state of the other 11 men and documenting their deterioration. Petrov maintained a personal diary, a diary that would become one of the most significant pieces of evidence regarding what actually happened on North Pole 7. The diary was hidden after his death and only discovered decades later in a St. Petersburg archive. In the months leading up to deployment, as the 12 men trained together, Petrov documented their interactions with clinical precision. Subject 3 demonstrates increasing signs of anxiety when discussing family separation. One entry read, Subject 7 shows concerning dependence on authority figures, will be useful for manipulation. Subject 5 has underlying fear of confinement that can be exploited through isolation protocols. These were not personal observations made to understand the men better. These were operational notes, planning documents for psychological warfare. By June 1961, the 12 men were ready for deployment. They were flown to a Soviet Arctic base on the Siberian coast, a remote facility where the final preparations for the North Pole 7 mission would occur. Here, they received their equipment, specialized cold weather gear, radio transmitters, scientific instruments, food supplies for 1 year. They also received another type of equipment that was never documented in official records, containers of chemicals and drugs. According to declassified KGB documents that would surface decades later, these included amphetamines, to be used to induce sleep deprivation, sedatives for behavioral control, and LSD derivatives for psychological manipulation. None of the 12 men were explicitly told about these chemicals. If they asked questions, they were told the containers held only vitamins and medical supplies necessary for extreme polar conditions. In reality, every man on North Pole 7 would be an unwitting subject of a drug experimentation program that the Soviet Union was conducting in parallel with its official Arctic research. This was not a new practice for the Soviets. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, the Soviet military and the KGB had been experimenting with chemical and psychological methods to enhance control over personnel. The Arctic stations provided an ideal laboratory for such experimentation. The isolation was complete. The men couldn't seek outside help. No independent observers could verify what was happening. Any psychological effects could be attributed to the natural stress of the Arctic environment. By mid-July 1961, the 12 men were ready for deployment to North Pole 7. A Soviet military transport plane flew them north to a site on the Arctic Ocean where the ice platform that would serve as North Pole 7 had already been established. The platform was larger than previous North Pole stations, approximately 500 meters across, with multiple buildings, a main shelter for the men, a laboratory, a storage facility, and a secondary shelter that would serve as isolation chambers. Over the radio, Soviet command congratulated them on their selection and their willingness to serve the Soviet state. What command did not tell them was what the secondary shelter was actually for. The isolation chambers had been designed not for emergency shelter, but for sensory deprivation experiments. Men would be placed in these chambers, alone, in complete darkness, cut off from all sensory input, for periods ranging from several hours to several days. This was the true purpose of North Pole 7, not to study the Arctic, to study what happened to the human mind when every protective mechanism was stripped away. As the 12 men settled into their new home on the drifting Arctic ice, they had no idea what was about to happen to them. They believed they had volunteered for a scientific mission. They believed they were heroes serving their country. They believed they would spend 1 year on the ice, conduct important research, and return home to accolades and advancement. They were wrong about all of it. The month of August 1961 would pass normally enough. The 12 men established routines. They maintained equipment. They began meteorological observations. They gathered ice samples and analyzed water chemistry. Everything appeared to be proceeding as planned. But in Moscow, a decision had already been made. The experimentation would begin in September, when the Arctic darkness started to deepen, when the sun began its descent toward the horizon for the last time that year, when the psychological effects of darkness and isolation would begin to naturally compound, when the manipulation could begin in earnest. The 12 men had only weeks left before their ordinary lives would cease to exist. They didn't know it yet, but Dr. Petrov knew. Petrov was already taking notes, already documenting baseline psychological states, already preparing the protocols that would be used to break these men psychologically. The experiment was about to begin. September 1961, North Pole 7. The sun was dying. On September 21st, the equinox, the sun set for the last time. It would not rise again for 186 days. The Arctic night had begun. The 12 men had been on the station for nearly 2 months. They had established routines, conducted meteorological observations, maintained the equipment. The daily structure had given them something to hold on to. But now, as the daylight diminished hour by hour and the darkness deepened, something shifted. Dr. Petrov noted in his diary on September 23rd, "The darkness is affecting all crew members. Mood has become noticeably darker. Sleep patterns are already disrupted. Subject 2 reports nightmares. Subject 8 shows signs of early depression." This was documented clinical language. But what Petrov was actually witnessing was the beginning of a psychological collapse engineered by the Soviet state. Starting in early September, the experimentation had begun in earnest. The first protocol involved sleep deprivation. Amphetamines were introduced into the food supplies without the men's knowledge or consent. These drugs were mixed into coffee, into meal rations, into the vitamin supplements the men were taking during their morning medical check-ins. The effect was insidious and deliberate. The men couldn't sleep. They would lie in their bunks for hours, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, their minds racing with thoughts that wouldn't stop. Their bodies were exhausted, muscles aching, eyes burning, but the chemicals flooding their systems wouldn't allow rest. One man kept a personal journal that would later be discovered, not in official Soviet archives, but hidden in a relative's possession after the collapse of the USSR. His entries from early September revealed the psychological toll. September 10th. Cannot sleep. I lie awake for 8 hours last night, then slept perhaps 30 minutes. My hands shake, my thoughts are racing. I cannot concentrate on the meteorological readings. Dr. Petrov says it's normal. The transition to polar darkness affects everyone, but something is wrong. It feels deliberate. After 3 weeks of disrupted sleep, 3 weeks of a mind unable to rest, the psychological effects were severe. Paranoia began to emerge. not the mild suspiciousness of normal human experience. Clinical paranoia, the kind where perception becomes fundamentally distorted. The meteorologist, the man with the wife and 2 children in Leningrad, became convinced that the others were plotting against him. He stopped eating meals with the group, convinced the food was poisoned. He began to examine his food obsessively before consuming it, checking for signs of contamination, separating components on his plate. When others tried to convince him the food was safe, it only reinforced his conviction that they were part of the conspiracy. The engineer from Siberia became hypervigilant, suspicious of every gesture, every word. He would lie awake listening to the others breathe, convinced that they were communicating in code, that the rhythm of their breathing was a cipher. He began to keep a log of the timing of their breaths, the patterns, the silences. He was certain that if he could decode it, he would understand the conspiracy against him. The doctor underwent a different transformation. Instead of paranoia, he experienced what would later be diagnosed as anhedonia, the complete inability to feel pleasure or joy. He performed his duties mechanically, but without engagement, as though he was observing himself from outside his own body. But Petrov's diary reveals the horrifying truth. The paranoia and dissociation weren't spontaneous products of the Arctic night. The chemicals being administered weren't just amphetamines. Mixed into the food supplies were also low-dose hallucinogens, LSD derivatives that the Soviet military had been experimenting with throughout the 1950s. These were compounds derived from research conducted at Soviet military psychiatric institutes, substances that had never been tested on human subjects under such extreme conditions. These weren't being given in quantities designed to produce obvious hallucinations. Instead, they were being administered in microdoses, precisely calibrated to produce subtle perceptual distortions. The effect was like reality becoming slightly unstable. Sounds seemed distorted. Voices would echo in ways that didn't match the acoustic properties of the station. Shadows appeared to move. The ice beneath the station seemed to groan in threatening ways, in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost like language. The men couldn't articulate what was happening. They weren't hallucinating in any classic sense. They weren't seeing pink elephants or impossible geometric shapes. Reality wasn't breaking down into obvious unreality. Instead, everything was slightly wrong, slightly disturbing, subtly threatening. When the meteorologist reported hearing voices, they came from inside the station. He could swear it. But when he investigated, he found nothing. No one was speaking. Yet the voices continued. By mid-September, one of the men, a radio operator, reported that he was receiving signals that didn't correspond to any known frequency. He said they were coming through the radio equipment at night, a series of tones and pulses that seemed to contain meaning, but that he couldn't decode. When Petrov examined the radio equipment, there was nothing unusual. All systems functioned normally. But the radio operator remained convinced. He began to believe that the signals were messages, that someone outside the station was communicating with him directly, bypassing the normal radio frequencies. Late September 1961. The second phase of Operation Nightingale began. By late September, the first man was sent to the isolation chamber. The isolation chambers had been constructed away from the main shelter in a separate building connected by a tunnel. They were small, approximately 2 meters by 2 meters, with walls of thick insulated material and an inner lining of acoustic dampening material. Each chamber had minimal equipment, a narrow cot, a small toilet, a water dispenser built into the wall. No windows, no natural light whatsoever, no means of communication with the outside world. The isolation chambers were soundproof, designed to eliminate all external auditory stimuli. The man selected was the electrician, a younger crew member, perhaps 26 years old, who had begun showing early signs of psychological distress. He had started to argue with the others during meals. He had become irritable, aggressive, then withdrawn. He was told the isolation period was a medical observation, routine as part of their polar station protocol. He would remain isolated for 24 hours for baseline physiological measurement. They said they needed to monitor his cardiovascular response to isolation to gather data on Arctic stress adaptation. It all sounded clinical, scientific, necessary. What actually happened was something else entirely. Complete sensory deprivation for 24 hours is a form of torture. The human mind is not designed to function without external stimulus. When all sensory input is removed, no light, no sound, no tactile sensation, complete isolation, the mind begins to generate its own input. The brain, deprived of external reality, turns inward. After the first few hours of isolation, the electrician began to experience what he would later describe as the dissolution of reality. He heard sounds that weren't there, footsteps, voices, mechanical noises. He saw lights in the complete darkness, geometric patterns, colors, shapes that moved according to no logic. Time became meaningless. An hour felt like a day. 10 minutes felt like weeks. He couldn't tell if he had been in the chamber for hours or for days. His sense of self began to fragment. By the 18th hour of isolation, he reported, in the fragmentary account he gave later, that he experienced something he couldn't describe as hallucination. It was more fundamental than that. He felt his consciousness splitting. He was observing himself from outside his own body. He could see his physical form lying on the cot, but he was watching from somewhere else, detached from his own flesh. In his panic, he began to pound on the walls of the chamber, screaming for release. He screamed for hours, his voice raw, desperate, until his vocal cords gave out and he could only make rasping sounds. No one came. The isolation chamber was soundproof. After the electrician emerged from the isolation chamber 24 hours later, he was fundamentally different. He spoke very little. When he did speak, his words were fragmented, disconnected from logical thought. He would begin a sentence about the coffee and end it talking about geometry. He stared at things for long periods without focusing, not seeing them, but looking through them. His eyes had a quality that disturbed the other men. They described it in later testimonies as being absent, as though the conscious person who had existed before the isolation chamber had been replaced by something that looked like a human, but that wasn't quite human. The other men could see something had changed in him, but when they asked what had happened in the chamber, he couldn't explain it. He would attempt to speak and become frustrated, unable to find words for the dissolution of consciousness he had experienced. Petrov's diary entry was clinical. Isolation protocol produced desired psychological disruption. Subject showed marked signs of dissociation, memory fragmentation, reduced ability to engage in complex thought. Effects persisting 12 hours post-isolation. Subject continues to evidence depersonalization. Reality testing compromised. But beneath the clinical language was the reality. The Soviet state had deliberately broken down the psychological functioning of one of its own citizens. And it was working perfectly. Over the following weeks, other men were placed in the isolation chambers. Some for 24 hours, some for longer, 36 hours, 48 hours. The protocol escalated. Later men were placed in the chambers with additional stressors. Strobe lights programmed to flash at specific intervals, designed to induce seizure-like psychological states. Recordings of distorted voices playing at barely audible volumes beneath the soundproofing. Each time a man returned psychologically altered. Some became aggressive. One man punched a wall so hard he broke his hand, the bone splitting through the skin in a jagged fracture. When asked why he had done it, he said he didn't remember the action, that it was as if someone else had done it while he watched. Another attacked a colleague, convinced the man was an imposter, that the real colleague had been replaced by something that merely looked like him. This man became violent. He tried to kill his colleague before others intervened. Some became catatonic, capable of basic functions like eating and using the toilet, but otherwise completely withdrawn from engagement with reality. They would sit for hours without moving, their eyes open but unseeing. Some experienced what would later be diagnosed as acute dissociative episodes, splitting off from their own consciousness, observing themselves as though they were separate beings. One man reported during a medical interview that he had watched himself from across the room during the isolation, that he had seen his own body lying on the cot while his consciousness floated somewhere near the ceiling. The experience had been so vivid that when he was released, it took him hours to convince himself that the separation hadn't been real. The medications continued throughout October and November. Sleep deprivation, hallucinogens, stimulants, all designed to push the men towards psychological breaking points, all coordinated in a systematic program of psychological destruction. Petrov documented it all in his diary, not in the clinical language of official reports, but with increasing precision as he watched these men psychologically disintegrate. October 2nd, first rotation of isolation protocols complete. All subjects show significant dissociative symptoms. Subject 1 and Subject 6 both report feeling they are not real, that they are performing their lives rather than living them. Subject 9 claims he is observing himself from outside his body. All effects match theoretical predictions. October 15th. Subject 4 has created elaborate false narrative. He believes he is not at the North Pole, but in a psychiatric hospital. He believes the others are orderlies and researchers. He keeps asking when he will be released, when the observation period will end. He exhibits terror. This is useful. The fear response makes him susceptible to suggestion during the reconstruction phase. October 22nd. The meteorologist has attempted self-harm. He was stopped before causing serious injury. He kept saying, "They're inside my head. They're writing things inside my mind. I can feel the words being written on the inside of my skull." We have confined him to restricted activity. He is dangerous primarily to himself. Monitoring ongoing. November 3rd, Subject 11, no longer responds to direct questions. He eats when food is placed before him, but shows no awareness of what he is consuming. His eyes track sounds, but he does not turn his head. It is as though consciousness is dimming or being deliberately extinguished. The psychological dissolution appears to be approaching completion, awaiting Moscow directives regarding next phase of operation. By early November 1961, the situation had deteriorated so severely that Moscow became concerned. The psychological experimentation was producing results, documented transformation of human consciousness, but it was also threatening the lives of the men. One man had already attempted suicide. Another was showing signs of complete catatonic breakdown. A third had developed what appeared to be psychotic symptoms. His sense of reality had fractured so completely that basic communication had become impossible. If a man died, if the experimentation became publicly known, the program would be exposed. There would be inquiries, there would be investigations, there would be international incident. Moscow issued new directives on November 7th. The isolation periods were reduced. The drug dosages were marginally decreased. The men were given brief periods of psychological recovery, periods where the aggressive experimentation was paused. But this wasn't mercy. It was calculation. The goal wasn't to destroy the men immediately. The goal was to understand how to break them and bring them back from the breaking point. The goal was psychological transformation, not annihilation. If the men were kept balanced on the edge of psychological collapse, stressed enough to be malleable, desperate enough to be manipulable, but not so destroyed that they became useless, they could then be rebuilt with new values, new loyalties, new identities. This was the true purpose of Operation Nightingale. Not just to understand psychological limits, but to prove that the human mind could be completely reconstructed, that a man could be broken down into his component psychological parts and reassembled as something new, that consciousness itself could be engineered. By late November, the experimentation had achieved what Soviet planners considered a qualified success. The men were psychologically destabilized. They had experienced enough trauma to be desperate. They were vulnerable to suggestion. The next phase of Operation Nightingale was about to begin, the phase where they would be rebuilt, the phase where their identities would be reconstructed, the phase where they would become something other than what they had been. But something was about to go wrong, something that no one in Moscow had predicted, something that would change everything. December 1961, North Pole 7. The reconstruction protocols had begun as planned. The men were shown Soviet propaganda films on the station's only projection screen, images of Soviet achievements, Soviet heroes, Soviet superiority. They were read passages from Lenin and Stalin, passages about the necessity of sacrifice for the collective good. Petrov began daily sessions with each man, framed as medical interviews, but actually psychological conditioning. For some, it was working. The engineer from Siberia became almost enthusiastic about communist ideology, his words carefully chosen, his responses perfectly calibrated to what Petrov wanted to hear. His fractured psychology seemed to reassemble itself around the Soviet narrative. He stopped questioning. He stopped thinking independently. He became what the program had designed him to become: compliant, grateful, ideologically pure. The doctor found the ideological framework comforting. After weeks of psychological chaos, the spinning thoughts, the dissociation, the terror, having a structure was preferable to the uncertainty that had consumed him. Any structure, even an oppressive one. But one man was different. His name was Mikhail Karpenko. Mikhail was 36 years old. He had a wife named Elena and 2 children, Dmitry, aged 8, and Natasha, aged 6, waiting for him in Leningrad. He had volunteered for North Pole 7, believing that this Arctic research would advance his career, that he would return a hero. Mikhail had not been selected by accident. His KGB profile indicated a certain psychological characteristic: deep family attachment. The planners of Operation Nightingale had believed this would make him vulnerable, that love of family could be weaponized, that his desire to see his children again could be leveraged for control. But they had misread him. Or rather, they had understood his attachment to family, but they had underestimated something more fundamental: his attachment to truth. In the first weeks of experimentation, Mikhail had been broken like the others. The sleep deprivation had fractured his thinking. The hallucinogens had distorted his perceptions. The isolation chamber had dissolved his sense of self. During his 36-hour isolation period, he had experienced what the others had experienced: the dissolution of consciousness, the intrusion of hallucinations, the feeling that his mind was collapsing under the weight of absolute sensory deprivation. But when he emerged from that isolation, something different began to happen. As his mind healed, marginally, incompletely, but still healing, something reasserted itself within him. Not compliance, resistance. Even as his consciousness was fragmenting, even as the chemicals and isolation were tearing apart the architecture of his mind, some core of Mikhail had held onto a single truth: this was not science. This was abuse. By early December, as Petrov began the reconstruction phase, showing the propaganda films, reading the ideological passages, conducting his daily sessions, Mikhail pretended to comply while something inside him remained awake, watching, analyzing. He understood what was happening. He had recovered enough cognitive function to recognize the patterns. The destruction of his sense of self, followed by the introduction of a new framework of meaning. This was textbook psychological manipulation. And he understood why. If you could break a man completely and then rebuild him with Soviet ideology, you would create a person who could not think critically, could not question authority, could not imagine resistance. You would create a perfect Soviet citizen. But Mikhail had something that the planners of Operation Nightingale had not fully accounted for: the psychological resilience that comes from having something worth protecting. He thought of Elena. He thought of Dmitry and Natasha. He thought of returning to them, of holding his children, of being able to look his wife in the eyes. And he understood. If he allowed himself to be reconstructed, if he accepted the Soviet framework that had been forced upon him, he would return to his family as someone different. Not physically, but psychologically, spiritually, he would be someone other than the man who had left. And that transformed man might do things that the true Mikhail would never do. On December 14th, during one of Petrov's sessions, Mikhail made a decision. He asked a question, a simple question, but one that cut directly to the heart of everything. "Dr. Petrov, why are we here? What is this really about?" Petrov, according to his diary entry from that day, was surprised. Most subjects at this stage were too psychologically compromised to ask direct questions. By this point in the reconstruction phase, their minds had been sufficiently destabilized that they simply accepted the new narrative being provided. But Mikhail's question revealed something troubling. The void created by psychological destruction hadn't fully formed. Some core of himself had remained intact. "You are here to serve Soviet science," Petrov replied carefully. "Your sacrifice is for the greater good. The research we are conducting here will benefit all humanity." Mikhail met his eyes, and then he spoke the sentence that would change everything. "You're lying, and I think you know you're lying. We're not here for science. We're here because the government wants to destroy us and rebuild us into something that will never question authority again. And the worst part is, you believe it's justified." Silence. Petrov's diary entry that evening revealed his emotional state, something unusual in his normally clinical documentation. Subject has achieved dangerous level of clarity. His psychological reconstruction has failed. He has maintained core identity despite intervention. This represents not simply failure of the protocol, it represents threat to the entire operation. He is capable of transmitting this clarity to other subjects. If others begin to question the narrative, if others begin to understand what is actually happening here, the entire structure of Operation Nightingale will collapse. But there was something else in Petrov's entry, something almost like admiration. "Subject has achieved what I thought impossible. He has survived, not psychologically destroyed, not ideologically reconstructed, but survived, intact, still himself. I wonder what I would have become if I had possessed such strength." Mikhail's clarity began to spread like a virus through the station. The other men heard about his confrontation with Petrov. In the small space of the station, information moved between them like an electrical current. And as they heard Mikhail speak truth, that this wasn't science, that they had been deliberately broken, that they were being deliberately reconstructed as different people, something began to change in them. The electrician, who had emerged from his first isolation chamber, nearly destroyed, began to question the narrative he had accepted. If this was science, where was the scientific method? Where was the publication of results? Where was the informed consent? The radio operator, who had been convinced he was receiving secret messages, began to suspect that his messages had been symptoms of poisoning, not evidence of external communication. The engineer from Siberia felt something crack in the ideological structure he had been building in his mind. By mid-December, Mikhail had begun to do something that represented the ultimate threat to Operation Nightingale. He had begun to keep a hidden record, using materials that the men had access to, paper from the laboratory, pencil stubs, fragments of writing surfaces. Mikhail began to document everything. He wrote down dates of isolation periods. He recorded his observations of what drugs had been introduced into the food. He documented Petrov's conversations, the specific things he had said during reconstruction sessions. Most importantly, he wrote down the truth of what was happening. December 16, 1961. This is not science. This is torture. This is the deliberate destruction of the human mind. This is being done by Soviet government agents on Soviet citizens without consent or justification. If this journal survives, it must tell the world what happened here. When Petrov discovered the journal, he found it hidden beneath Mikhail's bunk during a routine security search. His response was immediate and severe. According to his diary, Petrov felt betrayed. Subject has violated the fundamental trust that the experiment required. His deception suggests that he was never truly broken, never truly susceptible to reconstruction. His psychology is more resilient than anticipated. This represents a serious failure of the program. Moscow must be informed. But Mikhail had already anticipated this. He had written a second copy of the journal. This copy he had hidden somewhere on the station, a location he refused to reveal even under interrogation. Petrov sent the confiscated journal directly to Moscow in a classified package. But the hidden copy remained. On December 20th, 1961, Mikhail was placed in the isolation chamber again. But this time, according to Petrov's notes, the conditions were different. The duration was extended, 72 hours instead of 36. The intensity was increased. Strobe lights programmed to flash at frequencies designed to induce psychological distress. Distorted voices playing at barely audible volumes beneath the soundproofing. For most humans, this is beyond the breaking point. After 72 hours of complete sensory deprivation, of isolation so extreme that the boundary between consciousness and unconsciousness becomes meaningless, the human mind typically does not recover intact. Hallucinations become indistinguishable from memory. The sense of self dissolves completely. When Mikhail was removed from the chamber after 72 hours, he was fundamentally changed. He was not catatonic. He was not aggressively psychotic. But something essential had shifted. His resistance hadn't broken, but it had been battered, wounded, forced into a kind of psychological hiding. For the remaining weeks of December and into January 1962, Mikhail existed in a state of psychological suspension, neither fighting nor accepting, simply enduring. But his defiance had consequences. The other men had seen what happened when you resisted. They had seen Mikhail emerge from 72 hours of extreme isolation, his eyes haunted, his voice fragmented, his grasp on reality visibly loosened. Some of them retreated into complete compliance, but others, the engineer, the electrician, the radio operator, they maintained their resistance, but privately. They had learned from Mikhail's confrontation. Overt resistance would result in additional punishment. They pretended compliance while secretly maintaining their awareness of what was happening. They were following Mikhail's example, survive by appearing to accept the narrative while internally preserving the truth. By January 1962, North Pole 7 had fractured into two separate psychologies. On the surface, the men appeared to be undergoing successful reconstruction, accepting Soviet ideology, becoming the new Soviet men that the program was designed to create. But beneath the surface, a resistance was forming. A resistance made stronger by the knowledge of what they had suffered. A resistance strengthened by the fact that at least one of them, Mikhail, had documented the truth. And that hidden journal represented something that the architects of Operation Nightingale had never anticipated. Proof, evidence, a record that would survive even if they did not. Moscow was beginning to realize that Operation Nightingale was not proceeding as planned. The men were not being successfully reconstructed. The program that was supposed to create psychologically controlled soldiers and scientists had instead created men who knew exactly what had been done to them. In classified meetings in Moscow, the decision-makers began to consider an option they had been hoping to avoid. An option that would explain everything. An option that would ensure that the truth of Operation Nightingale never emerged. The evacuation of North Pole 7. But not a normal evacuation. An evacuation designed to ensure that the 12 men never told their story. An evacuation that would make Operation Nightingale disappear as though it had never existed. February 1962, Moscow. The decision had been made in a classified committee room, behind doors that only the highest Soviet officials were permitted to pass through. Operation Nightingale had become a liability, not because the program had failed, but precisely because it had succeeded. The men on North Pole 7 had been psychologically destroyed and rebuilt. But they had also been educated. They had learned what the Soviet state was capable of. They had learned that consciousness itself could be weaponized, manipulated, reconstructed against one's will. They had learned that the line between science and torture was a line that the Soviet government was willing to cross. And most dangerously, they had learned that they could survive that experience with their core humanity intact. Men like that, men who had faced the worst and endured, were unpredictable. They were dangerous. The program that was supposed to revolutionize Soviet control over the human mind had instead produced something unexpected. Men who knew exactly what had been done to them. Men who could never be fully controlled again. Men who had documented the truth. The Kremlin leadership faced an impossible choice: allow the 12 men to return to Soviet society where they might eventually talk about what had happened, write about it, share it with journalists or foreign agents or anyone who might listen. Or eliminate them. Eliminate them in a way that would appear accidental. Eliminate them in a way that would raise no questions. Eliminate them in a way that would allow Operation Nightingale to be denied, as though it had never existed. Officially, the decision was framed differently in the classified communications. The evacuation of North Pole 7 was announced as a routine end-of-season withdrawal. The men had completed their research. Fresh crews would rotate in for the spring season. Everything was normal. Everything was standard procedure. The official memorandum stated that the station's mission had been successfully concluded and that all personnel would be returned to Soviet territory for debriefing and subsequent assignment. But the communication sent to North Pole 7 from Moscow contained additional instructions. Classified instructions. Instructions coded in a cipher that only the most senior KGB officers possessed. Instructions that specified military transport aircraft, not civilian aircraft, as would have been standard. Instructions that specified which men would be on which aircraft. Instructions that specified evacuation timing in relation to weather patterns. For those who understood how to read them, for those with authority to comprehend what was really being planned, the instructions made clear what was actually going to happen. Mikhail understood immediately. He had recovered enough psychological function over the preceding weeks to understand that the evacuation was not an evacuation. It was an elimination. When he saw the evacuation orders, the specific routing, the specific aircraft assignments, the specific timing coordinated with a forecast Arctic storm system, he understood. The 12 men were not going to be flown back to the Soviet Union to face courts or tribunals or any kind of official reckoning. The 12 men were going to disappear. A military aircraft accident over the Arctic was easy to arrange. Accidents happened regularly in Arctic aviation. Weather was always unpredictable. Radio communications could fail. Aircraft could simply vanish over uninhabited regions and never be found. The wreckage would scatter across hundreds of kilometers of ice and rock and sea. If it was ever found, and the odds of it being found in the Arctic vastness were minimal, it would take months or years. By that time, the official story would be established. By that time, the men would be dead. By the time search efforts concluded, if there were serious search efforts, the story would have aged into irrelevance. The men would be listed as missing, presumed dead, the victims of tragic accident. No one would ever know that Operation Nightingale had existed. No one would ever know what had been done to them. Mikhail made a decision in those final days at North Pole 7, a decision that would echo across 40 years, a decision that would carry the only testimony the 12 men would ever leave behind. On February 20th, 1962, as the men were preparing for evacuation, Mikhail took his hidden journal, the second copy that he had never revealed to Petrov or to anyone else. The journal that contained everything: precise dates, exact times, detailed observations, direct quotes from Petrov, evidence of the drugs being administered through food analysis, descriptions of the isolation chamber, torture, documentation of the psychological transformation protocols, references to specific chemicals being used. He placed it inside a metal case designed for sensitive photographic equipment. He sealed it carefully with rubber gaskets and material that he hoped would preserve the contents against Arctic moisture and corrosion. And he hid it within the station's structure, not in an obvious place where initial searches would find it, but in a location where, if someone were looking for it systematically, truly looking, searching every cavity, every hidden space, they might find it, and where it might also remain hidden for decades if no one came looking. He didn't believe he would survive evacuation. He had already made peace with that knowledge. After everything he had endured, the sleep deprivation, the hallucinogenic drugs, the isolation chambers, the 72-hour sensory deprivation that had battered his consciousness nearly to the breaking point, he understood what was coming. But the journal might survive. The journal would carry the truth. The journal would be his testimony from the grave, testimony delivered not in words he could speak, but in the physical evidence of what had been done to him and to 11 other men. On February 21, 1962, the evacuation of North Pole 7 began. The men were told to gather their personal effects, limited belongings, a few photographs, perhaps letters from home. They were told they would be flown to a Soviet military base on the mainland. They were told they would be debriefed on their Arctic research. They were told they would then be transferred to their next postings. Standard procedure. Everything normal. The weather was poor. Visibility was limited to perhaps 30 kilometers. The wind was rising from the north at 40 kilometers per hour. The temperature was dropping as a forecast Arctic storm system moved in from the Arctic Ocean. But military operations didn't wait for good weather. The evacuation proceeded. The first group of 6 men boarded the Antonov An-12 transport aircraft on February 21, 1962. The aircraft was a rugged Soviet military transport designed for extreme conditions. It was equipped with 4 turboprop engines, sophisticated navigation equipment for its era, and a crew trained in Arctic operations. By any reasonable standard, it should have been able to handle a flight of a few hundred kilometers in marginal Arctic weather. The aircraft lifted off into the Arctic fog. The 6 men inside the transport, strapped into military transport seats, looking out at the swirling white void outside the windows, had no idea what was actually happening. Radio contact was maintained initially. The aircraft reported its position at regular intervals. It reported its altitude. It reported routine status updates. Then, 3 hours into the flight, radio contact ceased. The last transmission, fragmentary, urgent, navigation, visual references compromised, turning to compensate, altitude, and then silence. The aircraft was reported missing. Search operations were initiated immediately. Soviet military aircraft launched from the nearest base. Patrol aircraft from other Soviet Arctic installations searched the presumed flight path. But the Arctic was a vast emptiness. An aircraft disappearing into that vastness over an area of tens of thousands of square kilometers left almost no trace. Days passed, weeks passed, the wreckage was never found. The 6 men, their names, their families, their histories, simply ceased to exist in any official record. The families back in the Soviet Union received official notification that their relatives were missing and presumed dead in an aviation accident. The notification provided no details. The investigation was classified. The results of the investigation would remain classified for decades, if there were results. The second group of 6 men, including Mikhail, was evacuated 2 days later, on February 23rd. This time, the flight was even shorter before radio contact was lost. 2 hours into the flight, the aircraft's last radio transmission, fragmentary, unclear, as though the crew was struggling against something beyond their control. Experiencing weather complications, navigation systems, compromised, unable to maintain, altitude. Then silence. Another aircraft missing. Another search operation that yielded nothing. Another 6 men. Another 6 families. Another 6 lives erased from the official record. The official Soviet statement explained the 2 accidents as tragic results of Arctic weather conditions and navigation difficulties. Polar aviation was inherently dangerous, officials explained. Accidents were not uncommon. The 2 accidents, while regrettable, represented the kind of risk that was unavoidable in Arctic research operations. No investigation results were made public. No wreckage was recovered. No official reports were published. The men were memorialized on small plaques at Soviet polar research institutes. In memory of those who sacrificed for Soviet science, the plaques read. But most people forgot about them. Within a few months, the story had faded from Soviet media. Within a year, Operation Nightingale was completely gone from public consciousness. North Pole 7 was abandoned in 1962. The station drifted on the Arctic ice, gradually moving with the currents, gradually deteriorating under the assault of Arctic weather. Ice pressure would crack the structure. Arctic wind would peel away panels and roofing. Storms would scatter equipment across the ice platform. By the late 1980s, as the Cold War entered its final phase, the station had drifted so far that it was no longer strategically important. By the early 1990s, just as the Soviet Union was collapsing, the station had drifted beyond Soviet territorial waters. It was abandoned to the ice and the Arctic weather and the slow processes of decay. Decades passed. The Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991. With the collapse came the declassification of documents. Beginning in 1992, Russian researchers and international historians began accessing the classified archives of the Soviet state. Some documents were published in academic journals. Some were made available to researchers through the Russian State Archive of the Russian Federation. And within these documents, many of them heavily redacted, many of them still marked restricted access, references to Operation Nightingale began to appear. References to Dr. Anatoly Petrov, references to North Pole 7, references to 12 men who had participated in a classified Arctic research program, references to 2 aircraft that had crashed during evacuation in February 1962. Researchers began to investigate. Families of the missing men, families who had been kept in silence for decades, who had been told officially that their relatives had died in tragic accidents but were never given details, never allowed to grieve properly, began to search for answers. Descendants of the men, children who had never known their fathers, grandchildren who knew only stories passed down from grandmothers, stories of men who had volunteered for polar research and had simply disappeared, began to demand truth. But the truth was difficult to access. Many of the original documents had been destroyed. Many of the original researchers, including Dr. Petrov, who had died in 1987 and taken his knowledge to the grave, were dead. The Soviet government had been effective at its cover-up. Extremely effective, almost completely effective, but not perfectly effective, because somewhere, hidden in the deteriorating station on the Arctic ice, Mikhail's journal remained. And in 2002, 40 years after the evacuation, an Arctic research team from the University of St. Petersburg, conducting surveys of abandoned polar stations as part of a comprehensive climate change and Arctic history project, made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden within the metal structure of North Pole 7, beneath decking, within structural cavities, in a location that seemed almost deliberately chosen to preserve it, they found a sealed metal container. The container was corroded from 4 decades of Arctic exposure, but the seal had held. Inside the container was a journal. The pages were discolored from age. The ink had faded in places. Some passages were water-damaged and difficult to read, but the words remained legible. Written in careful handwriting that had become increasingly shaky and irregular as the journal progressed, it documented everything. Mikhail Karpenko's observations, Mikhail Karpenko's evidence, Mikhail Karpenko's testimony from beyond the grave. Testimony that had survived the evacuation, the destruction of the station, the deliberate cover-up, the decades of official denial. The journal was turned over to Russian authorities. The journal was analyzed by historians specializing in Cold War atrocities. The journal was made available to researchers and to journalists. And the truth of Operation Nightingale, a truth that had been buried for 40 years, a truth that the Soviet state had systematically tried to erase, finally emerged. But the truth came too late for most of the men. The truth came too late for Mikhail. Mikhail Karpenko had died in the Antonov An-12 transport aircraft on February 23, 1962, as the aircraft descended in conditions of poor visibility and failed navigation somewhere over the Arctic Ocean. He had died knowing that he had hidden the journal. He had died knowing that, even if no one ever read it during his lifetime, the truth would exist somewhere. He had died knowing that one day, whether it took 10 years or 50 years, someone might find it. And that was enough. That was all he needed. 2025. Present day. 63 years have passed since Operation Nightingale. 63 years since 12 men boarded military transport aircraft and disappeared into the Arctic. 63 years since Mikhail Karpenko hid his journal in North Pole 7. But the question that the discovery of that journal raised in 2002 remains unresolved. How many other Operation Nightingales were there? How many other programs, in how many other remote locations, conducted psychological experiments on unwitting subjects? How many other journals are hidden in abandoned Arctic stations, waiting for someone to discover them? How many other secrets did the Soviet Union take to the grave? The answer, according to declassified Soviet documents, is many. Operation Nightingale was not an isolated program. It was one example of a systematic Soviet effort to understand and control human consciousness. Between 1955 and 1991, the period between the end of Stalin's reign and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet military and the KGB conducted psychological experiments at dozens of locations across Soviet territory. In Siberian military bases, in psychiatric institutes disguised as hospitals, in Arctic research stations, in underground bunkers, in locations so remote that if something went wrong, if an experiment produced unexpected results, there would be no witnesses. The goals were always the same: understand the limits of human consciousness, develop techniques for psychological control, identify methods for behavioral modification that could be applied to political prisoners, ideological opponents, and anyone the Soviet state deemed a threat. The methods were always brutal: sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, chemical experimentation, psychological manipulation, isolation. And the results were always the same: human beings broken down and, in some cases, rebuilt as something other than what they had been. But Operation Nightingale had one unique characteristic: it had left behind testimony. Mikhail's journal, and that testimony raised a question that still echoes through history. Why did this program exist? What was the Soviet Union preparing for? What did they believe they needed to create? The answer appears in the declassified documents. Operation Nightingale was not purely about psychological control. It was about creating soldiers and scientists who could endure conditions of extreme stress without breaking, without questioning, without maintaining any residual independent thought. Men who could be deployed in hostile environments, Arctic regions, hostile territories, war zones, and maintain absolute loyalty to the Soviet state. Men who, even when faced with conditions that would cause psychological breakdown in ordinary humans, would continue to follow orders without question. The Soviet planners understood something fundamental. Total military victory requires not just weapons and equipment, but soldiers whose psychology has been fundamentally reconstructed. Soldiers who are no longer fully human. That understanding, that consciousness can be deliberately modified, that the human mind can be engineered for obedience, that psychological trauma can be weaponized, that understanding did not die with the Soviet Union. It spread, and it continues to spread. In the decades since the fall of the Soviet Union, declassified documents and survivor testimonies have revealed a disturbing pattern. The techniques developed in Soviet psychological laboratories have been adapted, refined, and deployed by other governments. In China's internment camps in Xinjiang, where over 1 million people, predominantly Uyghur Muslims, have been detained since 2017, the methodology mirrors what was done on North Pole 7. Systematic isolation, psychological pressure, forced ideological indoctrination. According to testimony from former detainees and documentation by international human rights organizations, the camps operate according to a logic that would have been immediately familiar to the architects of Operation Nightingale. Break the individual's sense of self. Create psychological desperation. Introduce a new framework of meaning, in this case, Chinese nationalism and communist ideology. Rebuild the individual around that new framework. The goal, according to internal Chinese government documents, is to transform minds and hearts. To create populations that cannot resist, cannot question, cannot maintain any psychological independence. In military interrogation programs conducted by various governments in the decades after the Cold War, techniques that emerged from Soviet research, forced sleep deprivation, isolation, sensory manipulation, psychological destabilization, followed by ideological reconstruction, have been deployed against prisoners suspected of terrorism and political opposition. In Russia itself, after the fall of the Soviet Union, security forces trained in Soviet-era psychological techniques have continued to deploy these methods against political prisoners, dissidents, and anyone deemed a threat to state authority. The techniques have proven remarkably effective, and they have proven remarkably adaptable. The fundamental principle that human consciousness can be deliberately fractured and reconstructed remains constant across all applications. Only the purpose changes. In the Soviet era, the purpose was military domination. In the contemporary era, the purpose is political and social control. But the underlying principle remains the same. This is the true legacy of Operation Nightingale, not the 12 men who disappeared in 1962, not the journal that Mikhail hid, but the understanding that human beings can be broken and rebuilt, that consciousness can be engineered, that the mind can be weaponized against itself. That understanding did not die. It evolved. And today, in 2025, it is being deployed on a scale that would have astonished the Soviet planners of Operation Nightingale. Mikhail Karpenko's journal remains in Russian archives. Researchers can access it. Historians have documented its contents. The truth of what happened on North Pole 7 is now part of the historical record. But the techniques, the understanding, the capacity to deliberately break the human mind and reconstruct it according to state specifications that did not remain in the archives. It went out into the world, and it is being used today. This is the warning that Operation Nightingale carries. Not a warning about the Soviet Union, which no longer exists, but a warning about human nature, about how systems, once they understand they can break consciousness, will break it. About how states, once they understand they can reconstruct the human mind, will reconstruct it. About how the techniques of psychological destruction are infinitely transferable and infinitely adaptable. Mikhail Karpenko understood this. As he hid his journal in 1962, knowing he would likely not survive the evacuation, he understood that the true importance of his testimony was not to expose what had been done to 12 men on North Pole 7. It was to warn the future, to provide evidence that states are capable of this, to document how consciousness can be weaponized, to show that once a government understands the methodology of breaking the human mind, that understanding will not remain locked away in classified files. It will be used, and it will be used again. Today, 70 years after Operation Nightingale began, that warning remains as urgent as it was when Mikhail hid his journal. More urgent, perhaps, because now the techniques have proliferated. Now they are known to multiple governments. Now they are being deployed on unprecedented scales. And now, perhaps most troublingly, we have begun to normalize them. We speak of interrogation techniques as though the systematic breaking of the human mind is merely a methodology, a tool, an acceptable price for security. We speak of re-education camps as though destroying someone's consciousness and rebuilding it according to state specifications is an educational enterprise. We have, in essence, accepted the premise that Mikhail Karpenko died refusing to accept, that consciousness can be deliberately fractured, that the human mind can be reconstructed, and that this is an acceptable tool of state power. But Mikhail's journal provides testimony against that acceptance. It provides evidence of what it feels like to be on the receiving end of such programs. It provides documentation of the horror, the desperation, the dissolution of self that occurs when consciousness is deliberately attacked. And it provides a voice for all the others, the people in Xinjiang, the political prisoners in Russia, the detainees in interrogation programs across the world, who have no voice, who have no documentation, who disappeared like the 12 men of North Pole 7 and left no trace. This is why Mikhail's journal matters, not as a historical document about the Soviet Union, but as testimony to the human cost of psychological experimentation, as a warning about what states can do when they understand they can do it. As a voice from 1962 speaking to 2025, Mikhail Karpenko died before he could see his testimony discovered. He died before he could see Operation Nightingale exposed. He died before he could witness the fall of the Soviet Union and the beginning of declassification. But his journal survived. His words survived. His testimony survived. And that survival is itself a form of triumph. A triumph not over the Soviet state, that system collapsed of its own contradictions, but a triumph over silence, a triumph over erasure, a triumph over the attempt to make Operation Nightingale and all its horror simply disappear. The question that remains for us in 2025 is whether we will heed the warning that Mikhail's testimony provides, whether we will recognize that consciousness is not an appropriate tool of state power, whether we will understand that the techniques of psychological destruction, once invented, never remain historical curiosities. They are deployed, they are refined, they are used again. Unless we decide as a global society that some technologies of the mind are too dangerous to use, no matter the justification. Unless we decide that consciousness is inviolable. Unless we decide that the deliberate fracturing of the human mind for any purpose is unacceptable. That decision has not yet been made. The warning has been issued. The testimony has been documented. The history has been recorded. But the future remains unwritten.